The entire hallway of the emergency treatment ward went still the moment the sound of shattering glass cut through the air from room 307. Inside, a retired Navy SEAL stood with his back against the wall, hands scarred, eyes red and hollow, breath coming in short, controlled bursts like a man still counting seconds between gunshots. In front of the bed, a black Belgian Malinois mix held its ground, body low, lips pulled back, a growl rolling continuously from its chest like an engine that never shut off. 3 security guards had already retreated to the far end of the hallway. The lead physician had just ordered a forced sedation. Then a nurse no one had noticed walked forward. She was small, quiet, the kind of person a room forgets the moment she enters it. She stopped at the door, crouched down to the dog's eye level, and whispered a single word, a name so softly that no one standing behind her could make it out. The dog stopped growling. Its body dropped out of attack posture. It sat. The guards looked at each other. The physician lowered his syringe. No one in that hospital knew that name. No file contained it. No record mentioned it. So how did she? If you've ever felt like the system was built to manage people rather than heal them, this story is for you. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Havenbrook Trauma Center looked like healing from the outside. The brochure showed wide windows, soft lighting, and staff who smiled with the warmth of people who had been trained to smile. The mission statement on the lobby wall read, "Restoring the whole person, mind, body, and spirit." Beneath it, in smaller print, a list of corporate donors whose names belonged to pharmaceutical companies and private equity firms. Mara Bell had worked in enough difficult places to know that the gap between what a building promised and what it delivered was usually measured in the people no one talked about. She noticed it on her first morning, not in anything dramatic, but in the small mechanics of how the ward ran. Medication carts moved on a strict schedule whether patients were ready or not. Doors were locked from the outside by default. The intake coordinator referred to patients by room number before she used their names, and sometimes only by room number. Mara said nothing. She had transferred in 2 weeks ago from a regional clinic, and she understood that new staff who asked too many questions on their first month rarely made it to their second. She kept her head down, learned the routines, and watched. She was 34, compact, with dark circles that had lived under her eyes long enough to feel permanent. Before civilian nursing, she had spent 4 years as a combat medic attached to humanitarian operations in active conflict zones, Iraq, then Mali, then a year in a rotation she was not supposed to describe in detail on job applications. She had treated blast injuries, extracted shrapnel, stabilized men who had stopped believing anyone was coming for them. She had also worked alongside military working dogs and their handlers long enough to understand something most people outside that world never learned. The dog and the handler were not separate units. They were one system. Damage one, and the other began to fail. Nobody at Havenbrook knew that part of her background. It wasn't relevant to trauma nursing in a private facility, so she left it off the summary. She was here to do her job, collect her paycheck, and figure out the next step. That plan lasted until room 307. She heard about Damon Vale before she ever saw him. The story traveled through the staff lounge in pieces, the way bad stories always do, dropped between coffee refills, passed in hushed tones near the supply closet. A former Navy SEAL, admitted 4 days ago after an incident at a veterans' transitional housing facility. The details of the incident were vague, which usually meant they were worse than what was being said. His chart listed him as combative, paranoid, non-compliant, and a danger to staff. He had thrown a meal tray at a nurse on day 1, shattered the observation window on day 2. On day 3, when 2 orderlies attempted to physically restrain him during a medication refusal, he put one of them against the wall hard enough to crack the drywall. The other orderly filed an incident report and requested a permanent reassignment. The dog made it worse, in the staff's estimation. A black Belgian Malinois mix, large and quiet in the way that large, quiet dogs are more frightening than loud ones. No one had been able to get close enough to check its tags. It had lunged at a physician who approached Vale's bed with a syringe, stopping just short of contact, but short of contact, as one nurse pointed out, was still close enough to feel its breath. The dog had no name in any hospital record. It had simply arrived with Vale, and no one had successfully separated them since. Dr. Celeste Farron passed the hallway outside room 307 on Thursday morning without looking through the window. She was speaking to her administrative assistant, her voice efficient and clipped. "This patient is affecting our Q3 compliance review," she said. "I need it resolved before the 15th. She did not use Vale's name. She did not slow her pace. That was all Mara needed to understand what kind of person Dr. Farron was. When the charge nurse asked for a volunteer to take room 307 on Friday morning, the break room went quiet in the way that means everyone suddenly has somewhere else to look. Mara raised her hand. The charge nurse stared at her for a moment. "You've read the incident reports?" "Yes." "All 3? "Yes." The charge nurse handed her the tablet without further comment, in the manner of someone who had stopped trying to talk people out of decisions that were ultimately their own problem. Mara stood outside room 307 for 2 full minutes before she did anything else. She looked through the undamaged portion of the observation window. Vale was sitting on the floor with his back against the far wall, not the bed, the floor knees up, forearms resting on them, hands visible. The bed had been pushed 2 feet to the left of its original position, angled so that anyone lying in it would have a direct sightline to both the main door and the window. The chair had been turned and placed with its back facing the door, positioned like a secondary barrier. The curtain rod was still intact, but the curtains had been bunched to one side, leaving the room open to whatever light came through. The dog, the Malinois, was lying on the floor to Vale's left, specifically at his left ear. Not at his feet, not beside him, at his left ear. Mara stood there and put the pieces together slowly. The repositioned bed, the chair as a barrier, the refusal to close the curtains. The dog positioned on the dominant side, covering the ear most exposed to a door approach. These were not the behaviors of a man who had lost his mind. These were the behaviors of a man whose training had never been given permission to stop. His nervous system still believed it was operating in a hostile environment, and everything he had done since admission, every thrown tray, every shattered window, every physical confrontation was consistent with that belief. He was not dangerous. He was not psychotic. He was still at war, and no one had thought to tell him it was over. Mara set down the tablet on the hallway cart. She turned to the security guard standing 6 feet behind her. "I need the alarm in this corridor shut off," she said. "Not reduced. Off." And the overhead lights dimmed by half. The guard looked at her. "That's not standard procedure." "I know. I'm asking for it anyway." He made a call. It took 4 minutes. The alarm panel went dark, and the fluorescent lights dropped to half intensity. Mara turned back to the door. She did not put her hand on the handle. She did not knock. She stood at the edge of the door frame where she would be visible through the window, weight even, shoulders relaxed, hands open at her sides, the body language of someone who was not approaching, not retreating, not preparing to do anything at all. She waited until the dog lifted its head and looked at her. Then she spoke, not loudly but clearly enough to carry through the door. "I'm requesting permission to enter your space, Chief." The hallway behind her was completely silent. Inside room 307, Damon Vale raised his head. It was the first time in 4 days he had responded to anything from the staff with anything other than silence or violence. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But his eyes, red-rimmed, exhausted, and still carrying something that had no name in any clinical manual, found her face through the glass and held there. The dog did not move from its position at his left ear, but it stopped growling. Mara did not enter room 307 that morning. She stood at the door for another 10 minutes, visible through the glass, doing nothing in particular. She was not performing patience. She was giving Vale's nervous system time to register that her presence did not precede an attack. When she finally stepped back from the door, she did it slowly and without explanation. That afternoon she reviewed every incident report filed since his admission, not for the conclusions, but for the raw timestamps and environmental details that case notes rarely bothered to record. She found what she was looking for in the margins. The first tray-throwing incident occurred 40 seconds after a metal medication cart collided with the door frame in the hallway outside. The observation window shattered on a morning when the maintenance crew was testing the corridor emergency lights, a series of rapid, strobing flickers that lasted less than 30 seconds. The confrontation with the 2 orderlies began when both of them entered the room simultaneously, moving fast, one cutting left and one cutting right toward the bed. Flanking approach, strobing light, sudden metallic impact. Every single escalation had a trigger, not a psychological one, a tactical one. Vale's body was responding to combat cues with combat responses automatically, the way a reflex bypasses thought. He was not choosing violence. He was executing the only protocol his system still recognized. Mara also noted the dog's behavior in the reports, reading between the language that described it as aggressive. In each incident, the Malinois had moved to position itself between Vale and the incoming threat before Vale himself had visibly reacted. The dog was not following Vale's lead. The dog was ahead of it, reading the room faster, responding first, functioning exactly as a trained protection and alert animal would. It was not a pet, it was a partner, and it was still working. She found the cloth patch on her 3rd day. She had been given permission to bring Vale his meals directly rather than leaving them outside the door, a small concession that Dr. Varon had approved without enthusiasm because it was cheaper than filing another injury report. Vale didn't speak to her. He accepted the tray and set it on the floor. The dog ignored the food and ignored Mara with the discipline of an animal that had been trained not to take distractions. On the third visit, Mara noticed the corner of something dark tucked beneath the folded clothes at the bottom of Vale's personal bag, which sat open near the wall. A piece of fabric, worn at the edges, the kind of thing that had been handled many times over many years. She didn't reach for it. She waited. On the fifth day, Vale was asleep when she brought the tray, genuinely asleep, which the night staff said had not happened since admission. Mara set the tray down quietly and crouched to look at the bag. The patch had shifted. She could read it now. Black Kestrel. She stayed still for a moment. She had heard that name once, 3 years ago, from a man named Dr. Gerald Okafor, a former military surgeon she had worked beside during a rotation in the Horn of Africa. Okafor had been drinking the night he mentioned it, which was the only reason he mentioned it at all. He described a special operations unit whose mission record had been administratively erased following a catastrophic extraction failure. Not declassified. Erased. The men who survived came home to paperwork that said they had never been there. Okafor had also mentioned, in the same conversation, a military working dog that had pulled the surviving members of the unit from a collapsed tunnel while under fire. The dog's operational call sign was Bishop. Okafor died 8 months later in a vehicle accident outside Nairobi. Mara had thought about that conversation perhaps twice since then. She thought about it now with considerably more focus. She did not know for certain. A patch was not confirmation. But she had spent enough time in field conditions to understand that waiting for certainty was a luxury that real situations rarely offered. The positioning of the dog at Vale's left ear, a trained alert position she recognized from her deployment years, and the dog's operational behavior, and now this name on a worn piece of fabric at the bottom of a bag belonging to a man whose records described him as simply a retired SEAL. It was enough to act on. If she was wrong, she would deal with being wrong. But if she was right and said nothing, she already knew how that ended. The order came down on Friday evening. Dr. Varan called a brief staff meeting that ran 12 minutes. She informed the team that effective the following morning, the dog currently present in room 307 would be transferred to an animal control facility, and the patient would receive a sedative protocol sufficient to allow the transfer to proceed without incident. She used the phrase "without incident" twice. She did not use Vale's name at all. After the meeting, Mara stood in the hallway outside the nursing station and worked through what she knew. If the dog was removed, Vale would not simply become distressed. He would lose the one constant in his environment that his nervous system had accepted as safe. The dog was not comfort, it was structural. It was load-bearing. Take it away, and there was nothing left holding the architecture of his composure together. She could sign off on the plan, follow the order, and keep her job. She had rent due in 11 days and no savings worth mentioning and a nursing license she had spent 4 years earning. Or she could stay. She thought about Okafor saying they came home to paperwork that said they'd never been there. She thought about Vale's hand resting on the scar at his throat every time an alarm went off, the gesture so automatic he likely didn't know he was doing it. She thought about the dog at his left ear, still working, still running a mission that everyone else had decided was over. She didn't sleep much that night. By morning, she had made her decision. The isolation started quietly, the way it always does. It began with a shift in the break room conversations that paused when Mara walked in and resumed at a slightly different angle after she left. Then came the small professional discourtesies. A supply request left unfulfilled for 6 hours. Her name left off a group email about a schedule change. A charge nurse, who had previously been cordial, now responding to her questions with single-word answers. One of the senior nurses, a woman named Patricia, who had worked at Havenbrook for 11 years, pulled Mara aside on Monday morning near the medication station. "You know what you're doing isn't helping him," Patricia said. Not unkindly, but with the firmness of someone who had learned to be practical at the expense of other things. "You're making yourself the story. And when this goes sideways, and it will go sideways, you'll be the one holding the damage." Mara thanked her and went back to work. Dr. Varan called her into the administrative office on Tuesday. The meeting lasted 9 minutes. Varan sat behind a desk that was larger than the situation required and explained, in language that was technically civil, that Havenbrook employed a full legal team that had significant experience converting staff misconduct into licensing board referrals. She did not say "if you continue." She did not need to. The sentence was complete without that part. Mara nodded, signed the acknowledgement form confirming she had received the verbal warning, and left. She kept going back to room 307. She did not try to have conversations Vale wasn't ready for. She did not carry a clipboard or ask him to rate his pain on a scale of 1 to 10. She brought his meals. She sat near the door if he was awake. and she paid attention to the room the way she had learned to pay attention to environments where the wrong move carried permanent consequences. She noticed that he kept his right hand on the scar at his throat for exactly as long as the corridor alarm was audible, then moved it back to his knee the moment the sound stopped. She noticed that the dog shifted its position slightly every time the ventilation system cycled on, angling its body to cover Vale's left side more completely. She noticed that Vale ate more on the days when the hallway outside was quiet, and almost nothing on the days when the maintenance crew was working 2 floors below. On Wednesday, she used an old contact number, a former colleague from her deployment years, a man named Staff Sergeant Derek Calloway, now retired and working private security consulting, and sent him a photograph of the black kestrel patch, along with Vale's full name. She didn't explain why. She wrote, "Need to know if this is what I think it is. No rush, but sooner is better." Calloway replied 4 hours later with 2 words. "Where'd you find that?" She wrote back, "Does it mean what I think?" He didn't answer that night. The order to remove the dog had technically been suspended, pending review, a bureaucratic pause that Varen had granted not out of consideration for Vale, but because the animal control facility had requested 24 Talmanig 0 HP Aspiro, hours notice, and the paperwork had been filed late. It bought Mara 1 extra day she had not expected. She used it. On Thursday morning, she arrived at room 307 earlier than her shift required, and stood at the door long enough for the dog to register her presence without alarm. When she spoke, she addressed Vale directly for the first time, in a way that was not procedural. "I'm not going to ask you what happened," she said, through the door, her voice level. "I don't need to know. But I want you to know that I've seen the incident reports, and I think every person in this building has misread what's happening in this room." Vale was sitting on the floor in his usual position. He didn't respond. "I'm not here to fix you," Mara continued. "I'm here because someone needs to be." The dog lifted its head and looked at her. Vale's eyes moved to the dog, then back to the door. He still said nothing, but he didn't look away. The following morning, the suspension expired. At 7:42 a.m., the animal control team arrived at the end of the hallway with a transport crate. 2 Havenbrook security guards came behind them. The anesthesiologist appeared from the direction of the medication room with a prepared syringe. "Doctor?" Varen was not present. She had sent her administrative assistant instead. A young man named Tyler, who looked like he genuinely wished he were somewhere else. Mara was already in the hallway. She had not been called. She had simply not left. The group moved toward room 307 with the coordinated efficiency of people who had been told this would be straightforward. The security guard at the front reached for the door handle and pushed it open in a single motion fast, the way you open a door when you want to control the first second. That was the mistake. The dog was on its feet before the door had traveled 6 inches. It crossed the room in the time it took the guard to finish the motion and planted itself between the door and Vale's position, body low, weight forward, the same posture Mara had seen through the glass on her first day. The growl was not loud. That was the part that made the animal control officer step back. Loud dogs announced themselves. This dog was calculating. Behind it, Vale had risen from the floor. He was standing against the back wall, back straight, and the expression on his face was not rage, it was something older and quieter than rage, the look of a man who has done the math on a situation and does not like the result. The anesthesiologist moved forward with the syringe. Mara stepped through the door. She didn't push anyone. She didn't raise her voice. She simply moved into the space between the anesthesiologist and the dog and stood there, which made forward progress for everyone behind her geometrically complicated without requiring a confrontation. The dog's growl shifted register shorter, sharper, a warning directed at the movement behind Mara rather than at Mara herself. She crouched down. She was aware of Tyler saying something behind her about procedure and liability. She was aware of one of the security guards moving left. She focused on the dog. She looked at its face, the set of its ears, the angle of its jaw, the tension in the muscles around its eyes that she had learned, a long time ago in a very different place, to read as precisely as a person's expression. She had one shot at this. If she was wrong about the name, she would lose whatever ground she had built. But she had spent 3 days turning Okafor's story over in her mind, and the dog's behavior, and the patch, and the way Vale's whole body had reorganized itself the first time she had addressed him by rank, and she had decided, the way she made decisions under pressure, by committing fully and not looking back. She said, quietly and without drama, a name that was not in any file in the Havenbrook system. "Bishop. Stand down." The room went silent in the way that rooms go silent when something happens that no one present has a framework to process. The dog's growl stopped. Its body came out of attack posture, not all at once, but in the measured sequence of a trained animal completing a command. "Wait back. head lowered, hindquarters down. It sat. Behind the dog, Damon Vale was staring at Mara with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not suspicion, not aggression. Something that looked, in the uncertain light of room 307, like the first involuntary loosening of something that had been wound tight for a very long time. He said nothing. Mara stood up slowly, turned to face Tyler and the team behind her, and said in a voice that was professional and completely even, "This procedure needs to stop. Right now." Tyler looked at his clipboard. "I have authorization from Dr. Varon." "Then get Dr. Varon down here," Mara said. "Because what just happened in this room needs a physician present, and it needs to be documented by someone with a medical license, not a clipboard." Tyler made the call. While they waited, Mara turned back to the room. Vale had lowered himself back to the floor. Bishop had moved to his left side and pressed its shoulder against his arm, and Vale's right hand had come off the scar at his throat and settled, for the first time she had ever observed, on the dog's back. She had bought him time. She didn't know yet how much. Dr. Varon arrived 12 minutes later. She walked into the hallway, assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds, and made a decision that Mara recognized immediately as the kind of decision people make when they are more concerned with controlling a narrative than resolving a problem. Varon did not ask what had happened. She did not speak to Vale through the door or acknowledge the dog's changed posture. She looked at Mara and said, "My office." Now, the suspension of the transfer order lasted 48 hours, not because Varon had reconsidered, but because the incident had generated enough internal documentation that moving forward immediately would create a paper trail that looked, from certain angles, like negligence. Varon needed the optics to settle before she acted again. She used the 48 hours productively. By the end of the first day, Mara had been formally reassigned. Her patient roster was transferred to other staff. Her access to the upper treatment ward was restricted, and she was moved to the record storage room in the basement level, a room that smelled of old paper and inadequate ventilation and contained 17 years of physical patient files that had not yet been digitized. Her official assignment was data entry. Her unofficial assignment, which everyone understood, was irrelevance. She accepted the reassignment without argument and went downstairs. The files were not organized in any way that suggested someone had expected them to be read. Mara spent the first 3 hours doing actual data entry, because she was still on the clock and because she needed the job. In the 4th hour, she started reading. She was not looking for anything specific. She was looking the way she had learned to look in environments where the most important information was the information no one had labeled. She read intake forms, discharge summaries, incident reports, medication authorization requests. She read the small print on the forms where additional notes were sometimes added by hand, in margins, in ink that had faded to the color of old bruises. On the 2nd day, she found the pattern. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It emerged from repetition, the same sequence of events appearing across different patient files, different years, different staff names. Veteran admitted with service animal. Service animal flagged as liability risk within 72 hours of admission. Service animal removed citing facility safety policy. Patient subsequently reclassified as non-compliant following escalation behavior. Patient medicated at elevated dosage. Discharge delayed. Billing extended. She counted 11 files that fit the sequence. 11 patients, across 6 years, all veterans, all admitted with dogs, none of whom left with them. In the 9th file, she found a name. Rebecca Harmon, 31 years old, former Army medic, admitted voluntarily for PTSD following 2 deployments. Her service dog, a yellow Labrador named Cody, had been removed on day 4 of her admission. The official reason cited in her file was unpredictable animal behavior in a clinical environment. In Cody's incident report, the specific behavior described was that the dog had barked once when a male staff member entered Rebecca Harmon's room without knocking. Rebecca Harmon was discharged 14 weeks later. She died 6 weeks after that. Folded into the back of her file, behind the discharge paperwork, was a single handwritten note on a piece of lined paper that appeared to have been placed there by someone who either didn't know what else to do with it or wanted it to exist somewhere, even if no one looked. The handwriting was small and careful, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone accustomed to writing in the margins of official things. They don't heal us here. They make us quiet. Mara sat with that for a long time in the inadequate light of the basement records room. Then she took out her phone and photographed every file in the sequence. That evening, Derek Calloway finally called. He did not answer her original question directly. Instead, he asked her 3 questions of his own: where she was, who the patient was, and whether she still had the photograph of the patch. When she confirmed all three, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Don't move on this alone. I'm making some calls." She asked who he was calling. He said, "People who've been waiting a long time to have a reason." She asked if he could get documentation, something she could put in front of a lawyer. "Give me 72 hours, he said. "And find yourself a good attorney before then. Someone who doesn't bluff." She didn't ask anything else. She trusted the tone more than she would have trusted an explanation. The video appeared on a Thursday morning. Mara saw it first on her phone. A notification from a colleague she hadn't spoken to in 2 days. 14 seconds of footage, shot from the hallway outside room 307 at an angle that captured the moment Mara had stepped between the anesthesiologist and the dog. The clip had been edited to begin mid-action, cutting the 30 seconds before it in which the door had been opened aggressively and the dog had reacted to the intrusion. What remained looked, to anyone who hadn't been there, like a nurse inserting herself into a routine medical procedure, while an unsecured aggressive animal moved freely in a patient room. The caption read, "Staff at Havenbrook, allowing dangerous animal to threaten medical team hospital investigating." By noon it had been shared 4,000 times. By the following morning, Mara's name was in the comments. 2 days later, Dr. Varen's assistant called and asked Mara to come in for a meeting with hospital administration and legal counsel. She was told it was routine. She was told it was a conversation. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, a document was placed in front of her, a non-disclosure agreement attached to a separation package that represented approximately 14 months of her current salary. The conditions were standard for these arrangements. She would leave the facility, relocate outside the metro area, and make no statement to press, legal representatives, or regulatory bodies regarding her time at Havenbrook or any patient she had treated there. The attorney sitting across from her had the professional courtesy not to smile. Mara read the document in full. It took her 7 minutes. No one in the room spoke while she read. When she finished, she set it down on the table and thought about Rebecca Harmon's handwriting. She thought about 11 files in a basement, 11 dogs removed, 11 veterans reclassified as problems to be managed. She thought about Damon Vale's hand finding Bishop's back for the first time, the small, involuntary weight of it, the way his shoulders had dropped 2 degrees when the dog pressed against him. She thought about what Calloway had said, people who've been waiting a long time to have a reason. She thought about the fact that she was $43 from overdraft, that the apartment building manager had called twice, that her brother had a medical school application being reviewed by a board that included 2 names she now recognized from Havenbrook's donor list. Those things were real. She didn't pretend they weren't. But she also thought about Rebecca Harmon, who had no one left to push the document back. She pushed the document back across the table. "I'm not signing this," she said. The attorney's expression did not change. The Havenbrook administrator looked at her legal counsel. The legal counsel made a note. Mara stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out of the room. In the elevator, she called a lawyer. She had found 2 nights ago through a veterans advocacy organization, a woman named Sandra Osei, who specialized in institutional misconduct and had a review score of 4.9 stars from former DOTO, clients who used words like relentless and doesn't bluff. Sandra Osei picked up on the second ring. "I have files," Mara said. 11 cases, 6 years, and I think I'm about to have a witness." Sandra Osei moved fast. Within 72 hours of Mara's call, a formal complaint had been filed with the State Medical Board. A preliminary inquiry request had been submitted to the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General, and a litigation hold notice had been delivered to Havenbrook's legal team, which meant the hospital could no longer legally destroy, alter, or restrict access to any documentation related to the cases Mara had identified. Calloway came through on the same day the litigation hold was served. He sent Sandra Osei's office a package directly. Sworn statements from 2 former Black Kestrel unit members confirming Damon Vale's service history, Bishop's operational record and decorated status, and the administrative erasure of the unit's mission file. He also included contact information for a retired JAG officer who had been attempting to restore Vale's official record through proper channels for 3 years without success. Sandra added all of it to the federal inquiry filing before close of business. Havenbrook responded the same afternoon with a countermove that was, Mara had to admit, well executed. They convened an internal review panel framed publicly as a proactive quality assurance measure and scheduled a formal hearing for the following week. The stated purpose was to investigate the conduct of staff involved in the Room 307 incidents. The actual purpose, which the framing only partially concealed, was to establish an official institutional record that positioned Mara as a rogue employee whose unauthorized actions had endangered patients and compromised clinical protocol before any external investigation could establish its own narrative. Mara received her hearing notice by certified mail and by email simultaneously, which suggested someone in the legal department was thorough. The hearing was held in the second-floor conference room, the one with the long table and the window that looked out over the parking structure. 7 people were seated on the panel side, 2 members of Havenbrook's board, the chief of clinical operations, Dr. Varon, 1 external consultant whose institutional affiliation was not introduced, and 2 attorneys. A transcriptionist sat at the end of the table. Mara sat on the other side with Sandra Osei. The first 40 minutes were Dr. Varon's presentation. She was precise, organized, and selectively thorough in the way that people are when they have prepared a case rather than an account. She presented the incident reports from Vale's admission in chronological order, emphasizing each physical altercation and each protocol deviation without the environmental context that would have explained them. She showed the edited video, which looked exactly as damaging at full size on a conference room screen as it had on a phone. She presented signed statements from 3 staff members, none of whom were in the room, describing a pattern of behavior from Mara that was characterized as insubordinate, emotionally compromised, and inconsistent with patient safety standards. She did not mention Rebecca Harmon. She did not mention the other 10 files. When Varon finished, the chief of clinical operations turned to Mara's side of the table and asked if she had a response. Sandra Osei said, "We do. But first we have a witness who has requested to address the panel directly. He's in the building." The board member on the left end said that was irregular. Sandra said, "So is a 6-year pattern of removing service animals from veteran patients as a billing strategy. We can discuss which irregularity the panel would prefer to address first." There was a pause of the kind that happens when a room recalibrates. The board member said they would hear the witness. Damon Vale walked in without the stiffness Mara had expected. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark pants, a plain gray shirt, and he moved through the door with the measured economy of someone who had learned long ago not to waste motion. Bishop came in beside him, not on a leash, walking in the precise position at Vale's left that Mara had first observed through the observation window of room 307. He took the seat across from the panel without being directed to it. He did not look at Mara immediately. He looked at the panel, taking in each face the way someone takes in a new environment, not performing the assessment. Then he placed both hands flat on the table and began to speak. He did not speak loudly. He did not speak with the cadence of someone who had prepared remarks. He spoke the way people speak when they are saying something for the first time that they have carried for a long time, and the weight of finally saying it is indistinguishable from the weight of the thing itself. He described the mission. Not all of it. There were parts he indicated with silence rather than words, gaps in the account that the panel could interpret however they chose. But he described the tunnel. He described the structural collapse and the darkness and the quality of silence that follows an explosion limicid. He described the point at which he had stopped believing extraction was coming. Then he described Bishop finding him, not with sentiment, with precision, the dog's behavior, its movements, the sequence of actions that had resulted in him and 2 other surviving members of his unit being located and pulled clear before the secondary collapse. He described it the way a man describes a mechanical process he has reviewed many times, because reviewing it is the only way he knows to honor it. "When I came home," he said, "Bishop came with me. That was the arrangement. That was what we were owed." He paused. This hospital tried to take him, not because he was dangerous, because he was inconvenient. He looked at Varon directly for the first time. "I've been in rooms where people were trying to kill me. I know what a threat looks like. The people in this building weren't threats. They were just wrong. About everything." He looked down at Bishop, who had remained still throughout, head up, watching the panel with the calm attentiveness of an animal that has been in difficult rooms before. "She was the first person who came to the door and asked permission," Vale said. He didn't gesture toward Mara. He didn't need to. That's not a small thing. In my experience, it's actually the whole thing. He stood up, and Bishop rose with him, and they left the room. The hearing did not produce an immediate resolution. That was not how institutions worked, and Mara had not expected it to. What it produced was a record, a clean, witnessed, transcribed account of Damon Vale's testimony sitting in the same official document as Varon's presentation, which now looked considerably different in context. Sandra Osei filed the transcript with the OIG inquiry the same afternoon. Over the following 3 weeks, 8 of the 11 veterans Mara had identified, or their families, came forward. 2 of the others were located by Sandra's office. The 11th, Rebecca Harmon, was represented by her sister, who had driven from out of state and who sat in Sandra's conference room with Rebecca's file in her hands and did not speak for a long time before she was ready. Among the Havenbrook staff who eventually came forward was Patricia. She had been at the facility for 11 years. She knew where things were kept and which dates had been altered and which signatures belonged to people who were no longer employed there. She submitted a full written statement to the OIG and did not ask for anything in return. Mara heard about it secondhand and did not comment. Some decisions people arrived at on their own schedule, and the arriving was what mattered. The State Medical Board opened a formal investigation into Havenbrook's clinical practices. The OIG launched a parallel inquiry into billing irregularities related to extended patient holds. 3 of Havenbrook's major institutional funding contracts were frozen pending the outcome. Dr. Varon was placed on administrative leave within 10 days of the hearing, a decision announced in a press release that described it as voluntary and used the phrase mutual agreement twice. Mara drafted a reform protocol with Sandra and a veterans trauma specialist named Dr. James Whitfield. It required 3 things. Every veteran admitted to a participating facility had to be assessed by a clinician with documented trauma, informed care training within the first 24 hours. Every service animal and military working dog accompanying a veteran patient had to be formally recognized as a component of the treatment plan rather than a facility liability. And any decision to separate a veteran from a certified service animal required documented clinical justification reviewed by an independent oversight board before it could be executed. It was not everything. Mara knew it was not everything, but it was a structural change, written into binding agreements, with names attached to it and a paper trail that could not be quietly erased. Vale called her once, during the 3rd week. The conversation was short. He was at a veterans rehabilitation facility 2 states away. He said it was different. He didn't specify how. He said Bishop had started sleeping through the night. Mara said she was glad. There was a pause, the comfortable kind. The kind between people who have said enough that silence doesn't need to fill in for anything. The thing you said at the door, Vale said. The first day. Requesting permission. Yes. Nobody ever did that before. Mara didn't answer immediately. Outside her window, the evening had gone the gray of early autumn, the sky holding its color the way skies do when the light has decided to stay a little longer than expected. They should have, she said. The new facility did not look like a hospital. That was the first thing Mara noticed when she pulled into the parking lot on a Tuesday morning in early November, 4 months after the Havenbrook hearing. The building was single-story, set back from the road behind a line of mature oaks that had gone amber and rust with the season. There was no corporate signage, no illuminated logo above the entrance. A hand-lettered wooden sign near the door read, Steadfast Recovery Center Veterans and Working Dogs Program. Below it, someone had added in smaller letters, recent enough that the paint still looked slightly brighter than the wood around it. Ring the bell or just come in. Mara rang the bell out of habit, and then came in anyway. The intake room smelled like coffee and wood smoke from a fireplace that was probably a fire hazard by 3 different codes, and clearly no one had the heart to remove. The furniture was worn in the way of things that had been chosen for use rather than appearance. On the wall beside the reception desk, framed simply without ceremony, was a photograph she recognized. Damon Vale and Bishop, standing outside in full sunlight. Vale had his hand resting on Bishop's back, not posed, not arranged, just resting, the way it had fallen naturally. Bishop was looking slightly off camera at something the photograph didn't show. Both of them looked like they were simply existing in a moment rather than performing one. Below the photograph, in plain black text on a white card, "Don't ask them what's wrong, ask them what they survived." Mara stood in front of it for a moment. Then she set down her bag, hung up her coat, and went to work. Her role at Steadfast was not purely clinical, which suited her. She worked intake assessments 3 days a week alongside Dr. Whitfield, whose manner with patients was so unhurried, it initially made the administrative staff anxious. She spent 1 day a week training new staff in the observation protocols she had developed, not from a manual, but from everything she had learned standing outside a door waiting for permission to be granted. The reform protocol had been adopted by 4 facilities in the state so far. Sandra Osei's office was in negotiation with 3 more. It was slow. It was the kind of slow that made you understand why people burned things down instead. Because burning was faster and the need was urgent, and the people who needed it couldn't always wait for slow. Mara had decided to work at slow anyway. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the 2nd week of November. She heard him before she saw him, not loudly, but there was a quality to the movement at the entrance. A kind of... She came out of the back hallway and saw a young man standing just inside the front door, still in his jacket, a dark green duffel bag on the floor beside him. He was perhaps 26. His hands were at his sides, but not relaxed, slightly forward, slightly open, the posture of someone ready to respond. His eyes were moving across the room in the pattern she recognized. Exits, sightlines, potential threats. Repeat. Outside the front door, visible through the glass panel beside it, a brown Labrador mix was sitting on the front step with its leash looped through the exterior door handle. It was watching its handler through the glass with the focused patience of an animal accustomed to waiting, but not accustomed to this particular distance. The young man's jaw was set. He was not going to ask about the dog. He had probably been told at 2 or 3 previous facilities that the dog couldn't come in, and he had decided that this time he would simply not ask, because not asking meant not being told no, and being told no again was something he had decided he could not absorb one more time. Mara walked to the front door and opened it. She unlooped the leash from the handle and held it out to him. The young man looked at her. He looked at the leash. Something moved across his face that she didn't try to name. It was the kind of expression that belonged to the person having it, not to anyone observing it. The dog came in and pressed immediately against his left leg, and his hand found the top of its head without him looking down, the way hands find things they have found 10,000 times before. He exhaled. Mara led them both toward the intake room. Behind her, she could hear the new staff member 3 weeks in, still learning, start to say something about facility policy. She turned, met his eyes, and gave a slight shake of her head. He stopped. She turned back and kept walking. When they were settled in the intake room, coffee on the table, dog at the young man's feet, Mara sat across from him and did what she had learned to do first, before the forms, before the questions, before any of the machinery of care that could either help a person or bury them, depending entirely on how it was operated. She waited. She gave him the room. She gave him the silence. She gave him the quality of attention that says, "I am not in a hurry, and you are not a problem to be solved, and nothing you say in this room will be used to make you smaller." The young man looked at the table. He looked at his dog. He looked at Mara. Then, slowly, he began to talk. Sometimes the most important thing one person can do for another is simply to stop. Stop moving. Stop assuming. Stop filling the silence and ask permission before entering someone's space. Not because it's protocol, because it acknowledges that the person in front of you still has a space worth entering carefully. Damon Vale didn't need to be fixed. He needed one person to see what was actually happening instead of what was convenient to label. So did Rebecca Harmon. So do a lot of people who never get that one person. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever known someone who came home changed, or felt like a system was built to manage people rather than hear them share it with someone who needs to hear it too, and if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. There are more people like Mara out there. They deserve to be seen as well.